Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversations. Norway is one of the most developed countries in the world and a major contributor to UN peacekeeping missions. It is a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, even though it is not a member of the European Union. Norway is a peace-building nation and has attempted to broker peace and build peace in various conflicts around the world, in the Israel-Palestine conflict and in the neighborhood in Sri Lanka. Today, in this rather offbeat conversation, I am going to discuss Norway's peace-building efforts around the world and the recent controversy about Norway mediating in the Kashmir conflict. Sort of a controversy, it didn't really pan out in any big way. To do so, I have with me a very distinguished guest, the Ambassador of Norway to New Delhi, Ambassador Nils Ragnar Kamsvåg. He has been the Ambassador of Norway to India since 2015, and his term is coming to an end later this week. Previously, he was Norway's Ambassador to Serbia, Macedonia and Montenegro from 2010 to 2015. He was also the Norwegian representative to the Palestinian Authority. Welcome to the NSC, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to being here.
Thank you. Let me begin this conversation with a question on how Norway views itself in the Comity of Nations. What unique role does Norway plays and seeks to play in the international community?
I think we are very focused on actually building a international order built on rule of law, and being a small nation. That is really a prerequisite for us, because small nations are really the ones who are paying the highest price if we don't have well-functioning international system, if we don't have, for instance, international trade routes, if we don't have a situation where, for instance, the UN is a center point for discussions about global development. So for us, we have always UN, international organization, actually building a better organized world has always been, if we would try to find one credo for our foreign policy, I think that is it.
What is unique about Norway as a country, not in terms of its geographical or physical endowments, but as an actor in the international system? You just told me what Norway seeks to achieve, a rule of law, a rule-based order in the international system. But what is it so unique about Norway that it can sort of contribute to that aim, to that objective in the international system?
I wouldn't say necessarily that we are unique as such, but I think we have been fortunate in some ways. One of our previous foreign ministers says that we, in one way, is a surplus nation in the way that we have been in the fortunate situation that we have had a fairly strong economy. And that has meant that we have maybe been able to contribute more resources relatively to further these goals internationally than what we otherwise would have been doing. So even though we are a very small country, a bit more than 5 million inhabitants, we are one of the biggest contributors in total, 6th or 7th biggest contributors financially to the UN, for instance.
And you've been one of the major contributors to the UN peacekeeping missions. So what explains that? Is that the rule-based international, the search for the rule-based international order, and what are some of your major contributions around the world?
No, I think when peacebuilding we have been in most of the particularly early period when we contributed soldiers, for instance, to if you take Middle East, the Sinai operations, which we had later on, the operation where you have observer force, which we had for a very long time. I had in Egypt, Syria, Jordan. We were the main contributors to the UNIFIL force in Lebanon. Were there for 20 years. We have contributed to UN operations in Africa. So we have generally tried to be a willing nation. We have also, together with the other Nordic countries, tried to contribute to educating the forces of other countries built on the experiences we have done and so forth. So we have had a close cooperation with many countries also on developing the peacekeeping forces.
Although over the after the end of the Cold War, since the last 30 years or so, your contribution to UN peacekeeping has come down. What explains that, if there is any particular reason?
First, it's relatively more expensive for us to send soldiers. We have contributed more in, for instance, kind, or also with financing in some cases. And then we have had, if you could take after 2001, most of our forces, because we have very small forces, have been tied up in Afghanistan first and foremost. So we really haven't had forces to contribute, although we have in some, we have, for instance, had our Navy has been operating in, for instance, the international operation against pirates along the coast of Somalia and so forth. We are a country with a standing army of not much more than 5,000 soldiers, so you know there are limits.
That's right. You know, Norway is seen as a peace-building nation around the world. What explains the peace-building tendency within the Norwegian government? What are the roots of peace activism?
Well, peace activism you have had a long time. You remember, we are, after all, the country which is giving out the Nobel Peace Prize every year. And it's always been a kind of strong internationalist tendency. When you had, for instance, after the Second World War, when it First World War, when you had the big hunger catastrophes in Ukraine, you had before that you had the situation of the Armenians in Turkey. There you had Norwegians who played key roles there, for instance Fridtjof Nansen, who of a great polar explorer who also got the Nobel Peace Prize. So we have a long history in modern times, so to say. It's the Oslo Agreement which really launched us as peace builder, and I think that's the kind of reputation we didn't consciously try to develop a kind of platform for Norway being some kind of peace negotiator. This came as a result of different processes happening at the same time, where for different reasons there were Norwegians player on the ground which started saw possibilities for peace building there, and it's gone from there. And because the Middle East conflict, as it's called for many, was seen as the mother of all conflicts, completely unsolvable. So when we got the Oslo Agreement in 1994, which was a great breakthrough, of course, this formed very much the view many other places also, that Norway, one way or another, either had special skills or capacities and so forth to play there. So a number of other peace efforts we have been invited into, I think, has been on the kind of reputation from that.
You know, I'm trying to understand, conceptually speaking, what explains the peace activism. Is it national interest or is it altruism? Say the United States sends its forces abroad for peacekeeping or engages in a peace building exercise elsewhere. There's a clear national interest involved there. India does something in the neighborhood, there is national interest involved there. The Norwegian emissaries doing the same thing, say for example in Sri Lanka or in the Middle East. What explains that? National interest or altruism?
Both, actually. Because, again, coming back to your first question, as a small nation, actually, we feel that we are more dependent on others, that you actually have a peacefully developed world. So that's the one part. But the second thing is also altruism. It is a strong feeling that because we have been lucky economically and so forth, we should contribute. I mean, you see it in the same as we have a very big development aid program. Actually, whether we are the biggest per capita, possibly we are having more than 1% of our GDP spent on development assistance every year. far above the goal of the UN of 0.7%, and it comes out from the same thing, is that those who have been given have the responsibility also to contribute, and I think that's deeply ingrained in us. But that's deeply ingrained in most cultures, I would say. But in many countries, the same efforts are within the country or something, or within the group you represent.
So this is sort of enlightened national interest, or national interest combined with altruism.
Yeah, I think that's well formulated.
What are some of the current peace-building engagements that Norway is involved in at this point of time?
Well, this is also interesting with some of this. Some of them are, of course, well known. They are in the newspapers.
Right.
Others, and that's the nature of the thing, maybe discussions going on where very few are aware of them, and they may or they may not succeed. Because many of the even if you go back to the Oslo Peace Agreement, for a couple of years nobody knew about those happening at all, and that was the key to the success of them. But if you look at ongoing processes, I mean, what has been known is, for instance, when it comes to the conflict in Venezuela, the government and opposition have met several times in Oslo over the last few months. We were, of course, on other process when it comes to the peace process in Colombia.
Right.
Norway, together with Cuba, we were the key international players in that process. We are currently also involved in the Philippines, for instance. And so these are just some of the ones which are ongoing.
How successful have Norway's peace-building efforts been abroad, in your opinion? For instance, the Oslo Accord and the envisaged this two-state proposal that sort of never really fructified. You don't have a two-state settlement at this point of time in the Middle East. The Sri Lankan situation, eventually it didn't really get anywhere. The Tamils are still complaining about it. So if one were to, as an academic, as an analyst, if I were to look at the Norwegian peace-building efforts abroad and say, the results have been mixed and not all that spectacularly successful. How do you sort of defend Norwegian efforts in this regard? No,
but I think that's a fair assessment you give, because I think we should, I sometimes comment that we live in an increasingly complicated world, and people are asking for increasingly simple answers. I mean, the reality is that there are no simple answers, and peace building is a very, very complicated process. That means that it's very, very difficult to make a kind of assessment. Has the Norwegian peace-building process been successful or not? I mean, because what is the key? And the Norwegian peace-building consists of very many different elements. I mean, when we contribute forces to peacekeeping, that's part of it. When we give development aid to try to reduce social tensions in a society, that's also part of the same thing. But if you take the kind of more traditional, the way it is, some kind of facilitation of talks or brokering of agreements and things like that. The key for Norway is in many ways that we don't make peace. It's the parties which make peace. So we can facilitate the peace, but I think the Norwegian chief negotiator after in Sri Lanka summed up in a book afterwards, since you mentioned that, he said that we can only help the parties try to find a peaceful solution. Yeah, but if the parties don't want it themselves, there is nothing we can do about it. So is it? So you could take Sri Lanka then. Clearly, it failed. Was it because of the Norwegians, or was it in spite of the Norwegians? I mean, because I think what is very important to see when it comes to a number of the places where we are involved, and I think when we were asked to come to Sri Lanka again, it's first and foremost because we are so small, we are completely disinterested. I mean, we have no economic interest in Sri Lanka. We didn't have it. We are far away. So, and I think what the parties wanted was exactly to have this disinterested kind of small player who could come in and do this. But so the starting point was actually that we cannot force them to do anything. I mean, what should the threat be against the parties? Only that we would go home. So the fact that you try and you fail, is that a Norwegian mistake? I wouldn't say that, but I think if you look at our track record, it illustrates how complicated it's been. But I think it's also because we see it takes big resources for us to do it. It's lots of political risks, including reputational risks, being involved in it. And I think that's also why relatively few countries are involved in it. So it's something we discuss all the time doing it. But I think in the end, our approach, and that may be a bit altruistic, it's important to try. I mean, if we see there is a possibility, it's not like everybody coming to us and ask, can you help, that we would say yes. I mean, you do an assessment both whether you think there is a chance of this happening. And you know, on many of these processes, if you look at, take Colombia, I mean, that's a process going on for 20 years. This is not, unfortunately, this is not, for the news cycles, this is not very successful. You know, you don't go in and you have a quick discussion and you come up with a signed agreement. It took 20 years. We see still that this is very complicated. It can still fail. So but over all those years, and I think the first secret contacts we got from the parties was in 2011. But before that, we had Norwegian civil society organizations working there, basically with no kind of goals of reaching any kind of agreement, but working with local communities to try to reduce tension and so forth. But that probably, when you ask back, well, that was probably one of the reasons why then the parties came to Norway afterwards, after a few years when they wanted to start talks, to ask us to be involved together with the Cubans at that time.
I think this is very interesting what you just said. Peace building is a complicated affair. It is not a sort of black and white sort of a situation, and that sometimes the process itself is the product. I mean, you sort of get the two parties, get them talk to each other, and that process itself is valuable, whether or not that leads to something at the end of the day. You know, I think again from what you just said, conceptually one could make a distinction between peace building that is mediated between two adversaries by a third party and forceful humanitarian intervention. Some states in the West believe in the forceful humanitarian intervention, but I think your approach seems to be more of a conflict mediation where parties are comfortable with you. I think that's a major distinction in the approach. I mean, coming from the South and situated in the global South, I think we have a sort of attraction for mediation in conflicts rather than in humanitarian interventions, which are seemingly forceful and not necessarily welcomed by the local population.
That's true, but you know, humanitarian interventions also have a different time frame often, because you end up in a situation, if you take interventions in Europe, for instance, on the Balkans, the interventions came not early. It was felt that they came late because so many people had been killed and so forth. So the question was, what else could you do in this situation?
Could you tell us something about your own personal involvement in some of these peace negotiations?
In the also peace process in the beginning, because what we got in one conflict, then we got the parties who normally wouldn't talk to each other at all. They met secretly, the leaders.
Which one is it?
And in the end, no result came out of it. But what was interesting was that we basically provided venue and had discussions a bit with them before and there. They came together and for a long time had discussions. And you know, that's if you have a conflict which has been going on for a long time. Take, for instance, Colombia, which clearly divided the population. It takes a lot of courage then to have secret talks with the ones you have been fighting with. So it's a big political risk, and then you have somebody there. We probably have developed a track record that we can be able to provide them with venues so that these talks can be secret, and if nothing happens, there is no political price to pay at home. This is also one of the things. There are very few people involved in many of these negotiations, particularly before they are known, exactly because you don't want them to be known.
This is probably one of the few occasions where I am seeing an ambassador or a diplomat not taking credit for what he or she has done. I'm giving you another chance. Do you want to tell us a little more about some of your personal involvement in peace building across the world?
On the follow-up on the Oslo agreement, because I was for a time in charge of Middle East and North Africa in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and afterwards I was our ambassador to the Palestinian Authority. And the kind of roles we have, it's not a static role. It changes over the time. So we had this negotiated agreement, Oslo agreement, which should have ended up in two separate countries living peacefully side by side. This didn't happen, but part of the task the international community and the parties gave to us that time was also to coordinate assistance into the Palestinian authorities. So on capital level, there is something called the ad hoc liaison committee, which is chaired by Norway. Normally, of a foreign minister if there are meetings, but the senior civil servants have the responsibility there. And then we have the local coordination, which is also shared by Norway. Then, so I have participated on both those things, but that's slightly different from the political negotiation that's said, but in our mind, as important in one way, because making what we were supposed to do, unfortunately, history has been a bit tricky. There is that the financing from the international community should help build institutions, should help build the state, which is a prerequisite for a peaceful solution also. So that has been, you could say from that point of view, that's what we basically, at that phase of the conflict, were doing.
Let me ask you a slightly controversial question. In November last year, a former Norwegian Prime Minister, Mr. Bondevik, visited Srinagar. Then he met some of the separatist leaders in Srinagar. Then he went on to meet people in the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. When asked by the media, he said, "I am here at the invitation of Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, the Art of Living founder, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar." The Indian government made no comment about it. Some media reported that he offered to mediate between India and Pakistan on the Kashmir question. You, as the Ambassador of Norway in Delhi, said that you clarified that it's his personal opinion. The question is it really that simple? Because there's a certain context to it. And media has reported the presence of a large Kashmiri diaspora in Norway. The Norwegian parliament has had a subcommittee on Kashmir since 1999. Its Foreign Affairs Committee has been interested in the Kashmir situation since the 90s. From time to time, the Norwegian parties have called on their government to mediate between India and Pakistan on the Kashmir question. Am I reading it right, or am I sort of overanalyzing it?
No, I think the broad lines there are correct in the sense that I don't think we have that many Kashmiris in Norway. We have a fairly big Pakistani diaspora which is active. We have a fairly big Indian diaspora also, but it's not very active politically in that sense. So there's been an interest for the situation, but I don't think that only has to do with the diaspora. I think it also has a kind of general focus in Norway on many conflict areas and potential areas of potential conflicts, and that's the kind of starting point for that. But as has been made clear on several occasions by the foreign minister in parliament also when these issues have been brought up, is that we have had a consistent policy on it, in the sense that we have heard parties loud and clearly here that India sees this as a bilateral issue. And remember what I said in the beginning is that we never go into any kind of conflict if not both parties ask for it. So we have, it has never been in the government's plans in any way to bring up the possibility for negotiations. So, but you know, private citizens are free to do, in democracies they are free to do whatever they like.
Exactly, and he is the head of a think tank in Oslo,
Yeah.
Prime Minister Bondelik. So
Yeah.
it's part of probably the mandate of his think tank.
Yeah, and they have been involved in talks in other countries also.
Oslo Center.
The Oslo Center, and so I think it was from his general interest and from discussions with Sri who has been in Norway many times also.
So let me clarify this.
Yeah.
So the Norwegian government believes that what people do, Norwegian citizens do vis-a-vis Kashmir or India, Pakistan, is what they're allowed to do as citizens of a free country. The Norwegian government would involve itself in a mediation anywhere in the world only with the invitation of the two parties. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's an absolute precondition, but it doesn't mean that we will involve ourselves even if the two parties want to have us involved. But that's a precondition, and that's why we never have been considering Kashmir from that point of view.
Now that we're talking about Kashmir, let me slightly shift gears and look at Afghanistan. Given your involvement there, NATO's involvement there, and now there's a peace settlement that is being negotiated, there's a withdrawal plan that is in place or that is being negotiated. How do you see the unfolding of the peace process in Afghanistan, and where do you think this is going to go ahead from now on?
It is a very, very complicated situation, but I think we also see that status quo has its big challenges, because and I think that has been driving, for instance, the American policy there, because they feel that there is no kind of end game in place with international forces being there. So that's why I think they have been driving very much on trying to get an inter-Afghan agreement there. What is positive, I think, in the process, we look at, and that from all processes, is that they try to be inclusive. First, when you talk about the international content here, you see United States, you see China, you see Pakistan, you see even Russia involved, the Europeans, and so forth. And India has been involved.
How concerned are you about Taliban taking over power, levers of power in Afghanistan?
No, that is certainly a concern. I think what my feeling from discussing with lots of also Indian experts, knowing Afghanistan very much, is that Afghanistan has changed since 2001. Actually, in all the focus on the challenges in Afghanistan, people also tend to forget that if you look at the role of the women, it certainly has changed very much since that time. The educational level of the population has changed. You have state institutions which are stronger today than they were 18 years ago. So I think the feeling is that there will not be a situation where you will have a Taliban takeover or anything like that. One shouldn't underestimate the strength and the popularity of the present government there. But clearly, and this is peace building is a very complex process. You know, you considering the alternatives. Often in these situations, they are not necessarily the best alternatives you can choose between. So this is I think from that point of view, it's a pragmatic process where they try to, and I think where the international community share very much the approach is that it's very important to try to preserve the what has been achieved in Afghanistan, and that's the starting point there. But then it is, as with all processes, it is a kind of also a step in the blind in a way, because how do the parties behave?
I mean, there's no guarantee that Taliban will abide by the promises that it is probably trying to make at this point of time during their negotiations with the Americans or the Western countries. There's no guarantee.
That's true. At the same time, I think sometimes, and I have to stress very much that I am not an expert on Afghanistan, but I think also when the most pessimistic ones think that this will lead to, for instance, Taliban dominating the country or something. It's a very different thing to be able to kind of run attack on an established force than actually maintaining the same. My feeling, at least from what's going on there, is that there is cautious optimism that we can find a workable solution. But
here's my final question. How do you describe the evolution of Norway-India ties since 2015 under your ambassadorship here?
I think over the last couple of years, particularly, there's been very good progress in development of these ties. The official visit of our Prime Minister in January was a very good, gave a very good push to the relationship, because we have established then an ocean dialogue, which I think is very important, because for India that you have huge ocean areas with a big economic potential, which has been underutilized. The government has realized that and had put down or established a committee on blue economy a couple of years ago. So when Prime Minister Modi suggested that we should cooperate on this, this was a good illustration of where two very different countries have something to contribute, because we get around 2/3 of our export values come from the sea. So we are strong on oil and gas exploration, seafood production, shipping, all kind of technologies in connection with the oceans, which fits very well with the initiatives here. And we share a common focus on the pollution of the oceans and on following up there. And so we were very happy both on the fact that we had a high level seminar on that during the visit, but particularly also on the follow-up afterwards. We have next week, this week we have a high-level group led by a secretary looking at our marine management, and we have had a joint working group of marine resources. In 2 weeks we have a group from India consisting of representatives from a number of ministries looking at integrated management of the seas. We have already more or less 4 ongoing joint projects on to fight pollutions of the seas. And I mean, bureaucracies often work fairly slowly, but this is achievements after the visit, which shows very strong interest in both sides on taking it through. Another area which has moved very strongly over the 4 years I've been here is actually scientific cooperation. We have more than 100 ongoing jointly financed research projects in a number of different areas, which is I think is really great. I think just the Indian part of the financing is more than 100 crore a year. So we have on polar research, antimicrobial resistance, smart grids, and so forth. So very, very varied, I think 10, 15 different areas. And this all has happened, from universities, that it takes time to develop this project. But all of these have come over the last 4 or 5 years, which I think is very encouraging and showing that actually we have in spite of the long distance between us and so forth, we have lots of things in common. And just last week I was in Goa. We were on Polar Research Institute there. We were picking a couple of candidates who are going up to Norway, and this is also kind of a good illustration on how the world is dynamic, because India relatively early established a research station up at Svalbard, which is an island north of Norway, where also 8 other countries have research, doing polar research. But of course what has happened with now the increased focus on climate change, and up there the climate change are taking place much earlier up in the north than they are further south. Additionally, researchers now found out that there is a clear connection between the melting of the Arctic ice and the melting of the ice in the Himalayas and the monsoons. So you know, this has got added the impetus over the last few years. So India is really putting lots of research into or funding into polar research now, which I think also is a reflection of the high focus of India on, for instance, climate change.
After spending 4 years in India, what are the memories that you're carrying back to Norway?
You know, it's a country in rapid change, but you know, this everywhere you go, the strongest impression you have is of the people you meet, the experiences you have, and the fantastic thing of being posted to a place like India is actually so many really knowledgeable people you can find. The fact that I used to joke that the Indian DNA makes it impossible for Indians to keep their opinions to themselves. So you get very, very interesting discussions always, which for diplomats is very interesting. And I don't think anywhere else I've been posted where you ever had this kind of openness as you see here, and also access if you take the size of the country. So it's for us it's really been a fantastic experience.
I hope you write a book about it one day. Ambassador, wonderful talking to you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yes.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.